From the previous two presentations, it's quite amazing to be here with such a interesting evening, interesting people, interesting ideas that were spoken tonight. I would be not true if I did not say that I'm not alone here, because without my wife, Nina, I would never be an architect. Really, believe me, she had her own career before I, in a way, forced her to work with me. And she's here, and really, she should be on the stage, but it's always kind of my name, but just know that it's not true. It's actually the two of us. This thought of Paul Valéry, a great French poet, also philosopher, stuck in my mind when I read his book, when he said that there are two dangers that constantly threaten the world: order and disorder. And it's true. Order threatens the world, as we see, and disorder threatens the world as well. So where are we? What can we do to create a balance, some sort of a midpoint, a balance in life and in architecture and in the city and in the world that isn't order, because you know that order very quickly leads to disorder, or disorder which very quickly leads to order. Both of them are not my favorites. Well, you are who you are because where you're born. That is certainly part of your personality. And I was born in Poland, in a city called Łódź. It's an interesting city. I'll tell you why. It was founded, actually it's called the City of Four Cultures because it grew very rapidly at the beginning of 19th century, and became the second largest city in Poland after Warsaw. Became kind of the Manchester, the factory city. And it was founded by four cultures. It was the Polish culture, the Jews, the Russians, and the Germans. It's really an interesting city. Somehow it was my destiny to be born, and I was born actually to parents who were survivors of the Holocaust. And I think what qualifies me in some sense to be an architect is that I was born in a homeless shelter. My parents just had no place, and my mother gave birth to me looking at the streets of Łódź with my sister when my father was trying to find any survivors, which he did not. I was in Łódź not long ago. It's still a fantastic city, historical city, a city that has suffered traumas of history and has a great future, I think. But when you go to the Jewish cemetery, which, by the way, I think is the largest Jewish cemetery in Europe. It has something close to, I think, 300,000, 400,000 graves. You see the fatality of the world. You see the fatality, the nameless death of the Łódź ghetto, the largest ghetto also during the Nazi time. So, yeah, that's part of who I am, where I come from. And, I lived in the city, and, in the typical courtyards of that city, typical buildings of that city. At that time, I didn't think it was poor. We thought we lived like on Park Avenue or Fifth Avenue in New York. But when I went back, I realized it was just another time, another way to orient yourself to who you are, what your parents do, and how to survive under a terrible system of communism. It was the communist dictatorship in a very powerful way. And even as a boy in school, we understood, we meaning our friends, small kids, that we lived under that huge portrait of Stalin, the dictator that took over Poland. And it's an irony that World War II started because of Poland. Yes, Poland was the reason that the Allies, England and so on, intervened against Germany invading Poland. And look at after the war, 1945, Poland became part of the communist bloc. It was taken over by the Soviets. So, yeah, that's the history of Poland. It's kind of the history of humanity. So, it was not just the grayness of Poland, and not just the communism and the gray skies and the conformity and the anti-Semitism, but also the beauty of Poland that so influenced my life. Not just the music of Chopin and, the poetry of Mickiewicz and the beauty of Zakopane and the Tatra Mountains, but architecture. And if you have never been to Wieliczka, which is really very close to Krakow, you should go. The underground city of salt. It's a city that was built already in the, I think, early 18th century, maybe late 17th century, as a city inside of the salt mines. And the salt mines were, of course, important, but they created churches, sculptures, black lakes. There's no light in it, right? It's just deep in the underground. By the way, it influenced a lot of German poets and philosophers. Schiller and Goethe traveled to Wieliczka to see this kind of marvel of what human imagination can do in such a situation. It's a Pyrenean world of wonder, but it's also the spirit of Poland to do something so impossible, and yet not to just use it as a means of living, the salt mine, but to create beauty, kind of an eternal beauty. So if you haven't been to Wieliczka, it's one of the most fantastic places you'll ever see, and it had a big impact on me. The crystals of salt, the churches made out of salt, the sculptures really stuck in my mind forever. Now, we were able to leave Poland because it was a kind of a prison for us as Jews. And from what is it, Wizard of Oz, we are not in Kansas anymore. We're not in Poland, and all the colors came to my life. I never saw color before, and the first color I saw was the place where we were really kind of exiled to because our passports were taken away from us, our Polish passports. We wound up in Israel, in Tel Aviv, and how amazing that city was at that time. City built by really German architects, German Jews, who were mostly students in the Bauhaus. So it's, to my knowledge, one of the only cities that is really Bauhaus. Now it's, of course, there are tall buildings, it's lost its kind of charm, but being there really kind of transformed my idea of what a city could be, from that industrial network of Polish cities that I knew to this Mediterranean city of possibilities. Now, what did I do there? One of my things that I was from the very early age was I was a child prodigy. I was a virtuoso in music, on an instrument. But it's a very odd instrument. People say, what did you play? Did you play the violin? Did you play the cello? Did you play the piano? Did you play the clarinet? Did you sing? No. I played an instrument that whenever I say it, the audiences burst into laughter, because it is an instrument basically associated with poor, with the Roma. It was the accordion. And now, why that instrument was so magical to me, and why my destiny is really connected to the accordion, because I wanted to play the piano, of course, as a little boy, and I started music, at the age of 5. But my parents were too scared of their neighbors to bring the piano to those courtyards. So they said, no, we can't bring the piano. We have a new piano. It was in a suitcase, a hidden piano. And so that was kind of my destiny. I became a virtuoso on that instrument. And when I came to Israel, somebody said, you should compete in the music competition in Tel Aviv, a famous competition called the America-Israel Cultural Prize Competition. So I came there to this hall. Everybody was a classical musician, young people from young to about 18, 21. And I came with accordion. The jury, I don't know whether you know his name, Zino Francescatti, one of the great violinists, Isaac Stern, the great violinist, Mrs. Kusevitsky, one of the founders of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. When I came to the room, actually my father carried the accordion. It was too heavy for me to carry it. And they looked at me like, this is the wrong person in the wrong room. But I have to say, when I strapped the accordion and I played the first, I think it was the first 4 chords of the toccata in D minor, because I played classical music, they stopped kind of smirking and laughing. And believe it or not, I actually was one of the winners, few winners, not many winners, The person on the, that's me, slightly there with a little bow tie. And on the right is Itzhak Perlman, Itzhak Perlman, one of the greatest violinists today. So, yes, I was probably the only one, according to Isaac Stern, who did not become famous in music, because that award is to become famous in music. Well, the accordion saved me in that sense as well. And I moved to the Bronx. Actually, you know, my parents worked in factories. Tough life for immigrants in America. It's not the rosy picture. It's a tough life. And we were lucky to get an apartment in what was then, forever will be, the first public housing project in the United States. Built in 1927. You can see 5 stories, no elevators, no air conditioning. But really, I thought I was in paradise, living there with this community of immigrants. And by the way, I just am finishing 2 projects. One is finished, one is almost finished in New York. Social housing projects. I won 2 competitions for housing, which contains, 30% homeless, completely homeless people, and the very, very, very poor. So yes, that had a big influence on how I see architecture, because when you grow up in social housing project, you realize the necessity of dignity that people need to have a future. So that's kind of my background, the Bronx. And for whatever reason, I wound up at the Bronx High School of Science, which was very close to where I lived. Now, you probably don't know that high school, but that high school has produced more Nobel Prizes than all of France. When I went there, it was, 99% Jewish. Every student in that school went from high school to a PhD course in MIT and Harvard, top schools, to become top physicists. And the school was actually created in part by John F. Kennedy for Americans to catch up with Russians in space technology. Now, I wound up there for the wrong reasons, because I didn't really want to be there. And I'll give you an example. When students were doing projects, and people were doing particle accelerators, they were doing experiments in radiation, they were doing experiments in atomic physics, in mathematics. What did I do? What could my project have been? Well, since my mind was not in that direction, I built, remember, this is the height of the Cold War, a perfect model of a nuclear shelter. My father was a very good artist. He helped me. So I built a perfect 3-dimensional model with scale figures. How would it be for a family like ours, which lived really just in a 2-room apartment, to live in the ideal atomic shelter during an atomic war? Well, I did not go to a Nobel Prize in physics. I did not keep contact with the friends who, won the most amazing awards and who are Nobel Prize winners. But I wound up in a school of architecture. Now, why I wound up in the school of architecture, I really don't know. But there was a question from my sister, who was 3 years older than I, and she said to me, it's March and universities are accepting students only till April. What schools are you applying to? So I said, I don't know. She said, well, what are the 3 free schools that you could go to? Because, of course, nobody had the money to pay tuition for a school. Schools are expensive in America. One of those schools was the Cooper Union, which was a full scholarship school. And I applied, and I had fantastic teachers. I was accepted with great skepticism, and they were right to be skeptical, because they said, somebody with your background in mathematics, physics, particle science, you shouldn't be on our school. You should be somewhere else. You should be pursuing other goals. But I had great teachers, John Haydock, Peter Eisenman, Richard Meyer, really illustrious architects of that era. And I have to tell you that I was a very good student, and I had great teachers who tolerated my kind of imbecility or rebellion, because I graduated from this professional program without ever drawing a single building. I really refused, because I said, if you don't have a political setting, if you don't have a client, if you don't have a social need, if you don't have a budget, what use is it to design the ideal high school, the ideal house? So I graduated, this professional course in architecture. Really, I was tolerated by great architects who let me graduate, but I never designed a building in that school. I did all sorts of other things in drawing and in building models, but never. Okay, I'll give you an example. In the structures class, we're to design a sophisticated house with all the technical systems in it, the plumbing, engineering, electricity, structure, model the complete house. This is before modeling was on computer, it was just done by hand. And I said to my teacher, who was a very famous engineer, Israel Sinak, one of the famous engineers in New York later on, I said to him, what use is it to design a private house? He says, I have no intention in my whole life to ever design a private house. It's a capitalist idiocy. I will never design a private house. Now, little did I know that I did design at least 3 houses. But, when you're young, you stick to strong ideas. Now, I showed you that diamond house because all my teachers were modernists. They loved Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, Mondrian. They were obsessed. They were called the New York Five. They were obsessed with bringing back modernity back into the world. But I had a very different experience because I lived in this small apartment with my sister and my parents, and the kitchen had the only table on which I could work. So after dinner, you have to clean the table, wash the dishes. The problem was that the table was a Formica table that my parents bought, very inexpensive, very, immigrant kind of table, which was brown. But the problem was not the brown, but it had round edges, big round edges. So straight for a while and then round edges. So when I went to, do my homework, which were, by the way, my homework was given, my school was full of Bauhaus refugee professors, not just Jews, Germans. Hannes Beckmann, who studied with, he was famous painter in his own right with Kandinsky and Paul Klee. They taught from those notes of the Bauhaus. So I had basically kind of a Bauhaus course in architecture. And we were given that famous Mies van der Rohe problem of drawing all the bricks with in between space, right? Draw them in perspective. But how do you do that with a T-square when you don't know exactly at what point you are just off by a 0.001 degree from the 90-degree angle? That was a challenge. And that's when I had my big revelation. I kind of realized that there is something subversive about the T-square and the right angle. That the right angle actually is a product of economics. If you have a good drafting table, I probably would never do what I do now because, it costs some money to have a drafting table and the space for it. But if you have just a kitchen table made of Formica with rounded edges, you discover that it can give you freedom. And you discover there are at least 359 other possibilities where that edge slides around, which frees you to think about architecture in a different way. It's funny that a kitchen table, a Formica table, bought by an immigrant parent, can change your life. Yeah, I always think if I was a little bit richer, I probably would be a very, very conventional architect. So what did I do with my time? Well, I became, I was a professor, a teacher. I was the head of a school of architecture at Cranbrook. And I show you this kind of drawing that at that time I was doing, but I don't know whether you can read the names, but I invited to the school. I received just 1-year contract. They said, we're going to close the department. It's a very famous school with Rosarin and Bertoia, all the famous American Bauhaus came from. They gave me a 1-year contract because they were going to close the school. I said, that's a pity. Let me try. And I invited to the school everybody I admired in the world. From Aldo Rossi to Sverre Fan to Richard Rogers to every famous person in architecture, in theory, Colin Rowe, Joseph Rickwert, many luminaries to lecture, to teach there. And yes, I actually built the department and left after 6 years, 7 years. And I always thought of that time of thinking, what is architecture? If you think about somebody like Descartes, who invented really the modern science, He basically said, I doubt everything. Let me tell you, I doubt that everything that I've been thought is true. Probably none of it is true. It's all a lie. It's all falsehood. Let me start from zero. Let me even think that there is no God. There is nothing. Just let me think about it. And of course, he created that X and Y axis, the axial system. The idea of the world, of science, was created by a man in a pajama sitting somewhere in France, looking at his fireplace and thinking, all of the stuff around me is not quite what it appears to be. The second person that I was really obsessed with was Brunelleschi. Somebody who said, there is a new way to see things, which I'm going to invent for you. I'm going to invent a way which you never saw before. It's called the perspective. What is close to me is large. What is far from me is small, and infinitely small over there is God, which is the complete reversal of the Chinese. The Chinese thought everything close to me is very, very large, and everything far away from me, everything close to me is very, very small, and everything far away from me is very, very large. Just look at perspective drawings of China. Just the reverse. Inventing a symbol. Look at Mendelssohn, another kind of crazy genius. He said, all I have to do is listen to a Bach or Beethoven, phrase with my pen and pencil, and right away I can design anything you want me to design. Madness and genius and desire are very close to each other. So just an example of what architecture is, was, can be, might never be. So what did I do with my time? You would wonder. Since my first building was built, Nina just told me that, when I was 54 years old. I never built a single building before. My road to architecture was drawing, but I didn't draw ideal buildings. No, I was not interested in ideal buildings. I was interested in kind of the structure of space, the structure of architecture on a two-dimensional body, piece of paper. And I created really large sets of drawings that were, in a way, a echo of my favorite architects. If you look at Borromini, Guarini, Alberti, great architects of our time, of all time, they created Palladio, a treatise, as a sense of, order, how to go about building architecture. They didn't just start by going, to build a building. They started with, let's say, a theory. And by the way, theory in Greek means a way to see. So yes, that was my treatise of architecture. And by the way, I have to tell you the story because that's kind of where it starts and ends in a way. When we came to Berlin in 1989, before the wall fell, I got a little certificate, for Jewish Museum. There were many great architects in the competition. And clearly nobody had any intention to build such a building. It won the competition, probably because it was considered not a building that could be built in every way, in the way it looked and what it said and how it functioned. So we were walking with Nina, and we were actually on our way to Los Angeles, to the Getty. I was invited to the Getty Center for, a fantastic offer to do just my own work and be paid for it with a villa in Santa Monica. So we were about to go there, and then we stopped on that street on Helmholtzstrasse, I still remember. And Nina said to me, so what are you going to do now? And I stopped in the middle of the street and I said, shouldn't we be staying in Berlin instead of going to the Getty Foundation in Los Angeles? Maybe Nina said it. She's probably if it's smart, she said it. And she said, well, how can we do that? How can I, do anything with you, since in my whole life, I've never been in an architect's office. And I said, this exactly applies to me. Because, to be honest, I spent maybe 2 days in an architect's office. I tried it. with some famous architects for 1 day, 2 days. And I thought architecture is definitely not for me. It's just too boring. It's too banal. It's too conventional. And there's just too much, irrelevancy in it for me. But life really takes you in unexpected directions. And, I share with you this. After doing my drawings, I tried to create kind of self-reflexive machines, which I did with some of my students. Machines that, by the way, this project was for Venice Biennale, where I won the Lion of Venice. It was how to design a city. There was a project designing a particular set of cities. But my idea was to create machines, really very primitive machines, to remember something. On the left, the memory machine. It was really modeled after, Giordano Bruno and Campanella's machines that really he showed to to the kings of France, to remember the right things. A kind of medieval machine, which also had those 8 books which I wrote, that turned the wheel that came right back to the same position all the time, the wheel of the eternal return, a kind of medieval nihilism that Nietzsche loved. And the last machine was this machine that had these 49 rotating cubes. So people could rotate them in any way they wanted. And these cubes had sort of emblems and possibilities of reflecting of an ideal city. And I've used the machine. Unfortunately, the machine disappeared. All of them were actually burnt, ironically, and you like this because I couldn't make it up, in the League of Nations building in a terrorist attack in 1988. So even though Aldo Rossi wrote a preface to the book about these machines, he really believed that they were hidden somewhere and that they existed somewhere, but they didn't. So that was kind of my road to architecture. And that road is a very strange one because I didn't set out to be an architect. I didn't ever dream that I would be doing what I'm doing. And yet, kind of, I'm destined in some way to the projects that I'm doing. It's strange because the project I'm doing, which are really all over the world, are sustainable, not only in terms of technology, but in terms of memory and history. Since the world runs out of memory and history so quickly, it's important to use that aspect to create an environment that has a meaning rather than simply AI. And of course, in my office, talented young architects showed me how easy AI can produce buildings that have a certain shape, that look in a certain way. It's kind of amazing and challenging. But I think what is missing in them, despite the fact that they are stunningly interesting, stunningly kind of amazing formulations, what is missing in them is the human connection to where we are coming from and where we are going, and that we are not really completely lost because we are involved in an art that has such a long tradition and has such a longevity. And as was said by the 2 previous speakers, it's an art that is for human beings to sustain them, not just to sustain them physically, but spiritually. Thank you.
Yeah, there's of course many questions to ask you. You said when you are young, you stick to strong ideas. And there is a question that I wanted to ask you is, what is in your opinion on how do you define good architecture?
It's a very good question. Look, the only disadvantage I suffer from now is too much experience. It's a terrible thing when you get experience, because experience begins to limit everything you know. Now, when I first started building, my first building, I had no idea what a window was, how a window was built. I had no idea what a wall section looked like. I had no idea how to create a foundation. And that was kind of fantastic. It was like an adrenaline of inventing it. And by the way, when I was working at the Jewish Museum in Berlin, I did not hire a single architect that had any experience. All the architects I hired were architects who never built even a small house. Because I said, we don't want to build something that was already built. We want to build something that we'll invent, that will be different. The window will be different. The angle will be different. The technique of... So Yeah. So what is the disadvantage of architecture is when you start knowing, it's really bad. You already know. I already know too much about this and that. My head is full of it, and every time I do a project, I try to sort of hit my head a little bit and empty it of some of the stuff that seems to be inevitably lodged in every brain that engages. So what is a good architecture? A good architecture, it's a good question. It's something that is beautiful, something that may be disturbing even, something that has a divine essence in it, some dimension of mystery, something that is not intentionally put into it. I like the architecture where no one intentionally put anything. Look, the Greeks never put intentionally, their divinities, only maybe on the pediment, but not in the architecture. The Chinese or the great Indian temples never intentionally put anything. It was just an expression of reality. So yeah, to me, the great architects I admire, architecture that is expressing reality in some way which was never intended.
When was the last time you experienced that?
Oh my God, I experience it all the time in cities. Everywhere you walk, there is something unintended that is beautiful. There is somewhere a corner, there is somewhere a piece of a building block even, where something beautiful is happening. And yeah, you cannot just generalize it, it's there.
And with that, or maybe in opposition to that, is there something that you consider a missed opportunity when you see a project that this has been built? Something that you consider bad architecture?
No, I think we have to remember that we are not gods. Le Corbusier, I have to tell you, I love reading his texts because he's kind of crazy. In one of his books, he says, when I get up in the morning, I feel like God. That's what he says. Like when I get up in the morning and I take my pencil, I feel like God.
Probably naked, right?
Yeah. So the problem is that we should not feel like God because we are fallible. We are human beings. We have limitations. We have to use those limitations to create something, not the pretension of competing with God. So yes, if I answered your question, I don't know.
Yeah, sure. That can work for me. I do have two more. So one is, of course, your first project, you were in your 50s, but you were able to build so many projects within the last decades, and that many of them are very large projects, and that carries great responsibility as well, but also popularity and also criticism. And I wonder, how do you deal with criticism, with people like that they disagree with the way you see envision a project, for example?
Well, I love criticism. We live in a democracy still. So everyone has a right. Everyone has a right to their opinion. But that doesn't mean that your work is driven by opinion. Your work has to be driven by something that has to do with integrity, authenticity, reality. But I'm not someone who... Look, when I was doing Ground Zero, which is not finished, the master plan, how many diverse groups of people were there against the project? There were people who said, you should not build anything for the next 50 years because we don't know what to do. There were people saying, you must rebuild the towers exactly as they were because that's what was destroyed and we must bring it back. That's the symbol of New York. Look, I believe that we don't have the luxury to wait 50 years and that we cannot just do a pastiche of the past. So you have to put yourself in a situation where you are under incredible pressure from the President of the United States, from the governor, from the mayor, from the public, from the families. But all I can tell you is that Ground Zero now, despite all the past, is the most probably visited site in the United States, 29 million people a year. And people of another generation come there. And that's, by the way, what I always think. You don't build buildings for people, for your clients. You build a building for people who will be born after the building is completed, who don't know any of that, who will come to New York, who will read about...
Nice hole with water, right?
Yeah, exactly. And yes. And it's not easy to fight against, a lot of pressure of money, of capital. Of course, a private site controlled by private investment. It's not a public site. Nobody declared it a public site. But I thought it must be the maximum of public space, and a space that really invites young people and others to come and experience kind of a new New York, a new sense of public space in New York. And so sometimes you have to go through, the fire of criticism in order to arrive. It's not immediate. It takes time. It takes time to be young.
One very last one, and it's that when we think of you and your work, the work of the practice, we think of many successful projects, and we tend to talk only about success. I wanted to ask you if you could please share a failure story with our audience. Is there a failure story?
Well, failure are, that I won as many competitions as I have lost. So look at all the competitions I've entered, which I've lost. So I consider that really a failure. But it's never really a failure, as someone said here before. If you do what you love to do, you will not fail. If you're authentic to yourself, if you're not fake, if you're really doing something that you really believe in and it's true, then no matter how many people tell you don't do it or it's not true, it's never going to succeed, sooner or later it will flourish, because it will flourish in you, first of all. So a failure. Maybe the only failure is that I never built some of the buildings that I wanted to build. And what are they? Well, they are buildings of mosques, of churches, of other buildings that I've designed, but because of politics, they have not yet been built, but they might be.
Fingers crossed. But it's also nice to hear from Nina that you were having a lot of fun.
Oh my God. I think that's the prerequisite. If you don't have fun, you might as well give up what you're doing. I've always thought that architecture, the only thing you need to be an architect, you don't need to know how to do anything. You don't need to even know how to draw. Gropius, I don't think ever drew a single drawing. You don't need to draw. You don't need to know anything about X structure. You don't need to know about the city. You don't need anything. You just need to have the desire to do it. And
having fun.
So the idea of enjoyment, of the wonder, is the critical and the prerequisite. That's what I was going to say. That the prerequisite that architects must have, only one. It's not a master's degree. It's not a graduate degree. It's not some course in civics. It's not a course in sustainability. It's optimism. You have to believe in the future. If you don't believe in the future, you cannot be an architect. You could be a poet if you don't believe in the future. You could be a general, a leader of a country.
Songwriter.
Some writers. You can be a musician. You can be almost anything as a pessimist. But that's the one thing that you cannot use in architecture. Because with every new idea, you have to dig into a foundation that's going to come after. And that's the beauty of architecture, that it's always the art of the future.
Thank you, Daniel, for the talk and for the interview. We really appreciate it.